Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here at AEI. And it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to a discussion of Land of Hope, the new one-volume history of our country by the great American historian Wilfred McClay. It's a book that comes at a time when questions of who we are as a people, of whether we can have a unifying rather than a divisive story, and of how to tell the story of our country in a way that neither sells short our national greatness nor whitewashes our national sins, are really live questions in our politics in what may be an unusual way. And this book is clearly intended to speak to just that moment, so there couldn't be a better time to hear from Bill about his sense of how to approach these questions. Bill McClay is a national treasure, pure and simple. He is first and foremost a teacher. He holds the Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He is admired and beloved by scores of students, past and present. He's also one of the great writers of American history. His book, The Masterless Self and Society in Modern America, was judged the best book in American intellectual history the year it was published by the Organization of American Historians. Among his other wonderful books of American history are A Student's Guide to U.S. History, Figures in the Carpet, Finding the Human Person in the American Past, and Why Place Matters, Geography, Identity, and Civic Life in Modern America. He's also been a historian active in the service of his country. Bill served for 11 years on the National Council of the Humanities, which is the advisory board of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's a member of the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which I tell you, in order to challenge myself to pronounce that word, the commission planning the official public commemoration of America's 250th anniversary in 2026. Bill's a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis. He received his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins. And with this latest book, he's made, I think, an extraordinary contribution to our capacity to understand ourselves. Land of Hope describes itself as an invitation to the great American story, and it exists to fill a kind of gap. There's not exactly a shortage of books about American history, of course, but an accessible narrative account of the arc of the American story that understands itself as an invitation to the American looking to become a fuller citizen of his country is something that we're certainly always in need of. Our format tonight is going to be very simple. Bill will talk about the book for a bit. He and I will then chat about it briefly, and then we will invite all of you into that conversation through questions and answers. So with that, let's welcome Bill McClay.
This is my first visit to the new and improved AEI. I'm finding my way around. It's wonderful to be here. This is an institution that I hold very dear and have for many years, and I think the fact that they've appointed Yuval to this important post is a very good sign about the future. So here, I'm going to stick this up here because I may not be using it. Anyway, this is the book. Yuval mentioned in his introduction some of what I was going to say about the reasons why I wrote the book, because for someone in the academy to write a book like this is a pretty insane proposition. It's certainly not anything that's going to help your career, and I didn't seek to use it to do that. But it did seem to me that, are we okay? Okay. It did seem to me that we have a problem, that the profession, the historical profession of which I'm a part, has made, I think, many advances. I'm not here to trash the historical profession, although we may do that in the question and answer period, but it's made many advances, particularly in articulating the experiences of the inarticulate, of the marginalized, of those who have been neglected by historical studies in the past. But the result, which is not necessarily the intended result, but the result has been a fragmented, fractured, incoherent, discontinuous understanding of our past, one that fails to convey to young people the larger arc of that history, as Yuval put it. Or it reflects the outlook of writers like the late Howard Zinn, who's somewhat questionably researched and politically tendentious People's History of the United States has sold over almost 3 million copies. I just checked on this. It's approaching 3 million. And has been treated as authoritative even in some of the best public and private high schools and other respectable classrooms. So the gist of this, the thrust of it, is that we're losing a general grasp on the public meaning of our own history. Professional American historiography, as I said, has made these many advances in the breadth and sophistication of its approaches to topics that have been neglected in the past. But what now is neglected is a broad, shared historical consciousness, public knowledge that we need to be able to think of ourselves as a coherent political entity, to think of ourselves as citizens, to prepare people for citizenship, not just in terms of the Civics 101 understanding of citizenship as a set of particular political rights and responsibilities, but in the sense of membership, of being members of a society, members of a country, part of a great story of which the American story is constituted. So this is a state of affairs that can't go on without producing serious consequences. A great nation needs and deserves a great narrative, needs to convey that narrative to the rising generations, to do so effectively, if it's to perpetuate itself and sustain itself in face of the challenges that are inevitably thrown up by the present and the future. It goes without saying that this story, this retelling, cannot be a fairy tale. It can't whitewash the past. It has to be truthful to be convincing. But there's no necessary connection between a truthful account, there's no necessary contradiction between a truthful account and an inspiring one, especially when the subject is American history. And we've ceased to provide that, either one, either truthful or convincing or inspiring in our schools today. So this combination of truthfulness and inspiration is really what I was after in Land of Hope, which the title itself, I think, begins to convey. I'm going to unpack that a little more as I go. And I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to read some passages from the book to give you a sense of the feel of it, the flavor of it, the tone and diction of it. Because that was one of the hardest things about writing. It was to find the right pitch that would be accessible to high school students, because after all, this is ultimately a high school textbook. I'm happy, I'm delighted, I'm amazed at the reception that it's gotten with general readers, with the adult reading public, for lack of a better term. But it's really meant for young people. It's meant to compete with not just Howard Zinn, but with the larded up, glitzy, and hyper expensive textbooks that are on offer. So the underlying aims of the book are clear in the outset, which is an epigraph that I've borrowed from an essay by John Dos Passos, who, as you may know, great American writer. For younger people who probably haven't encountered that name or read any of Dos Passos, I recommend him. He was a great radical in the 1920s, and in the fullness of time, came to a more vivid appreciation of this country and a profound sense of connection to its past. And let me just read you from this essay. By the way, this passage The title of the book was the first thing I wrote, which is sort of unusual. I had never done that before. That was usually the last thing I wrote. But I sort of thought this title epitomized what I wanted to achieve. So I taped it up to my computer monitor, Land of Hope, and had that there in front of me. And then the other thing I added was this. This required, it was on the side, propped up by a piece of cardboard, so it's longer. And this is Dos Passos. Every generation rewrites the past. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art. But in times of danger, we're driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. We need to know what kind of firm ground other men belonging to generations before us have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face, to meet them sometimes lightheartedly, and in some measure to make their hopes prevail. We need to know how they did it. And this is continuing with Dos Passos. This is the part I'm especially interested in. In times of change and danger, when there is a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and get us past that idiot delusion of the exceptional now, capital N, now, that blocks good thinking. That is why in times like ours, when old institutions are caving in and being replaced by new institutions, not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backwards as well as forwards. That's quite appropriate, isn't it, to our moment. Note that passage that I kind of marked out. Dos Passos is arguing that a sense of living connection to the past can be steadying and reassuring, a source of sustenance even in times of great upheaval. And that sense of connection with the past can free us from the illusion that we live in a time so different from all other times as to be completely without precedent, from the illusion that the past has nothing whatsoever to teach us. The thing all of us who teach in the humanities struggle against. We're all prone to think of this way about our present times, that the steady flow of dramatic and unsettling events and technological innovations render the past irrelevant. Young people, I think, are especially tempted to think this way because, frankly, they have less experience. It means they have nothing but the present as a point of comparison. But Dos Passos disparages this view as an idiot delusion. We would say idiotic, but he calls it an idiot delusion, and recommends the counsel of the past as something necessary and not merely desirable. It should add to the weight of these observations to tell you the year in which he wrote these words, 1941. This was a truly frightening moment in the history of the world, the history of the Western world particularly. Hitler is in control of the European continent. The very fate of European civilization seemed to hang by a thread. He could have been forgiven for thinking at this time that the past, in the midst of this unprecedented war, that the past had nothing to teach such a moment. But that's not what he said. And part of the point of looking backwards, as he counsels us to do, is that in doing so, we not only recover a sense of where we came from, but we learn to free ourselves from our mental imprisonment in the present, this provincial conviction that we have, that what we're seeing and experiencing and believing today represents the pinnacle of human knowledge and human possibility, the natural or inevitable state of human beings. When we learn to incorporate the past into our thinking, we enrich our imaginations, even as we become far less susceptible to idiot delusions. We become better people and more appreciative citizens. So we need a different kind of textbook, one that does not condescend to the past, but instead reaches back to it, seeks to recover the roots of our great story and present that story in its fullness, not merely in its coarseness, brutality, and failure, although not neglecting those things either, but in its triumphs and grandeur and world historical exceptional importance. It needs to take into account the importance of history as a reservoir of shared memories that make possible our cohesion as a people, make it possible for us to work together toward the achievement of common goals and common goods. It needs to teach us how to balance criticism with appreciation, an old word that I like very much, taking into account the perennial challenges of statesmanship as well as the conditioning role of circumstances and context in the conduct of policy and the making of laws and politics. Above all, it needs to understand historical knowledge as an essential element in the life of the citizen, a knowledge not only of institutions and rights, but a sense of membership, of both belonging and obligation. In addition, the book is unusual in the extent to which it asks its young readers to reflect on the meaning of the past. It tries to show them how to think historically, how to understand that history is not just an inert account of indisputable and self-explanatory details. Instead, as Dos Passos understood, history is a reflective task that calls to the depths of our humanity. It does not tell us what to think about the past and almost never presents us with a simple morality play, pitting white hats against black hats. It means learning to appreciate complexity, nuance, and context, the circumstances within which historical actors are constrained to act. It means asking questions and asking them again and again and again, and asking fresh questions as the experience of life causes fresh questions to arise in our minds. Now let me talk now about some of the book's more specific distinctives. First of all, there's the fact that it's a book. It's a tangible physical object rather than an intangible collection of pixels on a flickering screen. Thanks to my publisher, Encounter Books' wonderful efforts, they made it into a very handsome book. I do take credit for the selection of the cover art, however. But it's a handsome book, one that I hope, if people continue to have personal libraries in the future, that it will make its way into theirs and in family collections. By taking a stand with the permanence of the traditional printed and bound book, Land of Hope stands against the growing tendency of publishers and school systems to rely on digital materials only and confine students' experiences of reading to the ever more omnipresent screen. As we'll see, this is a matter of no small social significance. Digital text can be altered in the blinking of an eye. George Orwell was good on this. The permanence of a printed book, on the other hand, is an expression of the durability of the subject it addresses. Also, Land of Hope was not written by a committee, or while you're looking at the committee, with its parts pasted together like a hostage note, meant to please different constituencies and interest groups and stakeholders and political action committees and all the other vocal interested parties. The book was written by me, all by myself, typing up away in my attic without a gang of graduate students or research assistants assisting the process. The book reflects that fact. Readers will, I hope, hear in its pages the human voice of an actual author, and not a false imitation of the voice of God with an echo chamber synthetically added. And the writing has not been dumbed down, although it has in some cases been simplified, and I take pains to make it as lively and approachable as possible. I'll let you be the judge when I read some passages. Many of the book's thematic distinctives are hinted at in the title. As I mentioned, the title was the first thing I wrote about the book, and it does express some of the emphases that I knew I wanted to hew to as I proceeded. First, there is the word land. America is a land. It's not only an idea. True, it is in some respects the expression of an idea or of ideas about liberty, equality, self-rule, and other such things, and the universal standards that are set out in our Declaration of Independence, which in turn initiated a greater quest for liberty, equality, etc., in the nations of the world. We should not discount the historical influence, the transatlantic, the international, the worldwide influence of the Declaration, even unto today's protests in Hong Kong. But America is also a very particular nation with a particular structure and a particular history, which in turn means that its particular triumphs and sufferings, sacrifices, and our memories of these things are important factors that draw and hold us together. Precisely, they are the sacrifices and sufferings and victories, not of all humanity, but of ourselves, but of us alone in some cases. Arlington National Cemetery is a place commanding our devotion, not only because of the nobility of the American idea, but because the remains of our brave countrymen, some of whom are our fathers and brothers and relatives, are interred there. Second, there is the third word in the title, hope, concept of hope. And this is part of the book's argument from the outset, that the entire Western Hemisphere came to be inhabited by people who came from somewhere else. Most willingly, one great exception to that, people who came in bondage, but most willingly, restless and exploratory, unwilling to settle for the conditions in which they were born, drawn by the prospect of a new beginning, the lure of freedom, the space to pursue their ambitions in ways their respective old worlds did not permit. Hope is a word, a very powerful word in America. Hope has both theological and secular, even material meanings, as well as spiritual ones. All of these meanings have existed and still exist in abundance in America. And in fact, nothing about America better defines its distinctive character than the ubiquity of hope, a sense that things as they're initially given to us in life cannot be the final word about them, that we can never settle for that. Few qualities are more American than this, and it's a spiritual quality above all else, an aspirational quality that cannot possibly be adequately accounted for in merely material terms. Of course, hope and opportunity are not synonymous with success. Being a land of hope sometimes means being a land of disappointment, of dashed hopes. This is unavoidable. A nation that professes such high ideals makes itself vulnerable to searing criticism when it falls short of them, sometimes very far short of them, as we often have done. But we should not be surprised by this, just as we should not be surprised to discover that many of our heroes turn out to be deeply flawed human beings. All human beings are flawed, as are all human enterprises. To believe otherwise is to be naive, and much of what passes for cynicism in our time is little more than naivete in deep disguise. In America, hope is far too persistent and compelling a force to be defeated for long by such passing sentiment. And then finally, there's the theme, also in the title, of story. America has a story. And it's vitally important that our young people be acquainted with that story. Stories are how we organize the world. We organize them around stories that are constitutive of our social existence. We are, at our core, remembering and story-making creatures, and stories are one of the chief ways we find meaning in the flow of events. What we call history and literature are merely the refinement and intensification of that basic human need and impulse. So now let me give you a fuller sense of the book by presenting some excerpts, each dealing with an issue or event that's especially important and yet problematic in our view of the American past. Perhaps the single most sensitive subject in the presentation of American history is the place of slavery in the nation's past. The challenge in presenting the subject accurately is one of balance, insisting on the weighty importance of slavery without exaggerating its enduring significance. There's a tendency among the young to imagine that slavery was a uniquely American institution. But this, of course, is a profound misconception. The United States did not create slavery, did not create racism or racial prejudice. These evils are as old as human history and are the default position of human nature, absent some strong countervailing moral force. But the United States, while having a history that's touched by these evils and having participated in them, is also a country that has a larger history of which it can be proud of seeking to overcome such things. Yet how does one deal with the failure of the Constitution's framers, just for example, to deal with the problem decisively at the time of the country's beginnings? By the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the institution of slavery had already become deeply enmeshed in the national economy, despite all the ways that its existence stood in glaring contradiction to our nation's commitment to equality and self-rule as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Hence, there was real bite in Samuel Johnson's famous jibe. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? How, we wonder today, could such otherwise enlightened and exemplary men as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson have owned slaves, a practice so contradictory to all that they stood for? And as I write in the book, now I'm quoting from the book, there is no easy answer to such questions. But surely a part of the answer is that each of us is born into a world we did not make. And it is only with the greatest effort, and often at very great cost, that we're ever able to change that world for the better. Moral sensibilities are not static. They develop and deepen over time, and general moral progress is very slow. Part of the study of history involves the training of the imagination, learning to see historical actors as speaking and acting in their own times rather than ours, and learning to see even our heroes as an all-too-human mixture of admirable and unadmirable qualities. People like us, who may, like us, be constrained by circumstances beyond their control. And continuing here, the ambivalences regarding slavery built into the structure of the Constitution were almost certainly unavoidable in the short term in order to achieve an effective political union of the nation. What we need to understand is how the original compromise no longer became acceptable to increasing numbers of Americans, especially in one part of the Union, and why slavery, a ubiquitous institution in human history, came to be seen not merely as an unfortunate evil, but as a sinful impediment to human progress, a stain upon the whole nation. We live today on the other side of a great transformation in moral sensibility, a transformation that was taking place but not yet completed in the very years the United States was being formed. Hence, it would be profoundly wrong to contend, as some do, that the United States was founded on slavery. No. It was founded on other principles entirely, on principles of liberty and self-rule that had been discovered and defined and refined and enshrined through the tempering efforts of several turbulent centuries of European and British and American history. These foundational principles would win out in the end, though not without much struggle and striving and eventual bloodshed. The United States enjoyed a miraculous birth, but it was not the product of an unstained conception and an untroubled delivery. Few things are. Now, I wrote these, I wrote these words before the publication of the New York Times' 1619 Project, which I suspect you all are somewhat familiar with, which does, in fact, insist on the idea that America was founded on slavery, and a project that will, we are told, be producing and distributing materials for use in American schools to promote that idea. Absent a countervailing argument from books like mine, there's now a genuine danger that part of the education of American students will be the teaching that slavery is part of the nation's enduring makeup, its DNA, as a metaphor that they use rather too clumsily, I think. A lesson that would not only be false, but pernicious. A related lesson of history is that the wisdom of the statesman may often be less than obvious to contemporary observers, precisely because only the leader is in a position to understand all the essential forces that are in play. Being a great leader requires courage and imagination, even daring, especially when the outcome seems doubtful and the public is leaning in a different direction or is simply afraid. It may mean courting the displeasure of the multitudes and accepting unpopularity as a result. The book contains many examples of this that I could adduce, but let's take the case of Lincoln. We're so accustomed to thinking of Lincoln in heroic terms that we forget the depth and breadth of his unpopularity during virtually his entire time in office. Few great leaders have been more comprehensively disdained, loathed, and underestimated. A low Southern view of Lincoln, of course, is to be expected, but it was widely shared in the North, too. As Lincoln biographer David Donald put it, Lincoln's own associates thought him a simple Susan, a baboon, an aimless punster, a smutty joker. Abolitionist Wendell Phillips called him a huckster in politics, a first-rate, second-rate man. George McClellan, his opponent in the 1864 election, openly disdained him as a well-meaning baboon. Our rhetoric today can't hold a candle to that. For much of the election year, Lincoln was convinced, with good reason, that he was doomed to lose that election with incalculable consequences for the war effort, the future of the nation, and all that he had done, all that he had sacrificed to that end. So let me quote from the book again. We need to remember that this is generally how history happens. And this is very much directed towards the young people, but I think all of us can benefit from this. We need to remember this is generally how history happens. It is not like a Hollywood movie in which the background music swells and the crowd in the room applauds and leaps to its feet as the orator dispenses timeless words and the camera pans the room full of smiling faces. In real history, the background music does not swell. The trumpets do not sound, and the carping critics often seem louder than the applause. The leader or the soldier has to wonder, is he acting in vain? Are the criticisms of others, in fact, true? Will time judge him harshly? Will his sacrifice count for nothing? Few great leaders have felt this burden more comprehensively than Lincoln. And I do this a lot with other statesmen who in times of stress, to try to get people to appreciate what it's like to be in the shoes of someone who has to be the man in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt said. Let me also suggest something that Land of Hope relates to the story of the end of the Civil War in April of 1865 in a way that might hold some lessons for our fellow countrymen today who seem to regard the vestiges of the American past with contempt. And here's how I describe the scene in the book. This is a somewhat longer passage here. But on April 9th, after a last flurry of futile resistance, Lee faced facts and arranged to meet Grant at a brick home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse to surrender his army. He could not formally surrender for the whole Confederacy, but the surrender of his army would trigger the surrender of all others, and so represented the end of the Confederate cause. It was a poignant scene, dignified and restrained and sad, as when a terrible storm that has raged and blown has finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a strange and reverent calm, purged of all passion. The two men had known one another in the Mexican War and had not seen one another in nearly 20 years. Lee arrived first, wearing his elegant dress uniform, soon to be joined by Grant, clad in a mud-spattered sack coat, his trousers tucked into his muddy boots. Grant always was a fashion plate. They showed one another a deep and respectful courtesy, and Grant generously allowed Lee's officers to keep their sidearms and the men to keep their horses and take them home for the spring planting. None would be arrested or charged with treason. 4 days later, when Lee's army of 28,000 men marched in to surrender their arms and colors, General Joshua Chamberlain of Maine, a hero of Gettysburg, was present at the ceremony. He later wrote of his observations that day, reflecting on his soldierly respect for the men before him, each passing by and stacking his arms, men who only days before had been his mortal foes. And here I quote from Chamberlain, who really cannot be improved on. Before us in proud humiliation stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve, standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into a union so tested and assured? On our part, not a sound of trumpet more, nor roll of drum, not a cheer, not a word nor whisper of vain glorying, nor motion of man standing again at the order, but an awed stillness rather, and breath holding, as if it were the passing of the dead. That's Chamberlain's observations, and then my account picks up from there. Such deep sympathies in a victory so heavily tinged with sadness and grief and death. This war was and remains to this day America's bloodiest conflict, having generated at least 1.5 million casualties on the two sides combined, including 620,000, or some people estimate far more than that, deaths, the equivalent of 6 million men in today's American population. 1 in 4 soldiers who went to war never returned home. 1 in 13 returned home with 1 or more missing limbs. For decades to come, in every village and town in the land, one could see men bearing such scars and mutilations, a lingering reminder of the price they and others had paid. And yet, Chamberlain's words suggested there might be room in the days and years ahead for a spirit of conciliation, the spirit that Lincoln had called for in his second inaugural speech, a spirit of binding up wounds, of caring for the many afflicted and bereaved, and then moving ahead together. It was a slender hope, yet a hope worth holding, worth nourishing, worth pursuing. Well, we all know that it didn't turn out that way, thanks in large part to John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Lincoln. But the story, I think, is illustrative nonetheless. If Chamberlain and his troops could find it in their hearts to be that forgiving, that generous, that respectful of men who had been only days before their mortal enemies, we ought to be able to extend a similar generosity towards men from what is now, for us, a far more distant past. And we can be encouraged in this disposition by Lincoln himself, who said something similar at a cabinet meeting on April 14th, the very day of his assassination. It's so haunting. I hope, Lincoln said, I hope there will be no persecution, no bloody work after the war is over. Enough lives have been sacrificed. We must extinguish our resentment if we expect harmony and union. There has been too much of a desire on the part of some of our very good friends to be masters, to interfere with and dictate to those states, to treat the people not as fellow citizens. There is too little respect for their rights. I do not sympathize in these feelings. Perhaps Lincoln's hopes were unrealistic. Perhaps such an irenic outcome was impossible. Perhaps it would have entailed too many concessions to the defeated South. We can never know for sure. But given the high regard in which Lincoln is rightly held by most Americans and most of the world's greatest leaders, it would be a mistake not to pay attention to his statesmanlike example, not only in understanding the past in which he lived, but the present in which we live as well. Lincoln never lost sight of the fact that the war that consumed his presidency and finally his life would be a failure if it were not in the end a war of reunification and reconciliation, and not merely a war of conquest and vengeance. We will fare far better in our own debates and internal conflicts if we can recall the same thing. Finally, another act of statesmanship, one that was not all that controversial at the time, but has become highly controversial in the years since, President Harry Truman's decision to use the newly developed atomic bomb to bring the war against Japan to an end. Recall, so secret was the development of this weapon that the new president had not even been informed of its existence until becoming president after Roosevelt's death, and suddenly found himself as the one who had to make the momentous choice whether to use these weapons against Japan, and if so, how to use them. Well, in today's debates over the morality of using these new fearsome weapons, we've had an unfortunate tendency to view the decision apart from its context and without reference to the weighty responsibilities that a national leader like Truman had to fulfill under the circumstances. I try to counsel readers, as I try to counsel my students, against such weightless moralizing. Here's my description in the book of Truman's decision. Truman was a blunt, straightforward, and decisive man who did not agonize over his choices, and he quickly decided it would be imperative to use this new weapon as something that would save lives, particularly in light of the horrendously bloody experience in Okinawa and what it portended for a conventional invasion and occupation of Japan. But how best to use it? Given the fact that only 2 bombs were then available, and given the very real possibility that they're failing to explode properly, it did not make sense to announce a demonstration explosion in some uninhabited area to prove the weapon's awesome power. For one thing, the detonation might fail entirely and make American threats look hollow. Even if a demonstration bomb did explode, it might not have the desired effect anyway. And how, this usually scores, how could Truman possibly justify to the world his declining to use this weapon if that declining resulted in hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths? He concluded the only realistic choice open to him was to demand Japanese surrender in the starkest and most threatening terms, with a deadline attached, and when the deadline passed, to drop one of the bombs without warning on a valuable Japanese target. And that's what he did. There was a warning on July 26 to surrender or face the grim reality that, quote, the alternative to surrender is prompt and utter destruction. Then, when there was no surrender forthcoming, early on the morning of August 6th, a lone B-29 bomber dropped the first bomb unannounced on the port city of Hiroshima, a major naval and war industrial center. So a few words in closing, and then I welcome your questions and discussion. Come back to Lincoln again. One always does this. It was Lincoln who articulated in his first inaugural address the hope that what he called the mystic chords of memory would yet swell the chorus of union at a time when the prospects for the Union staying together were diminishing by the minute. He was appealing in a moment of great national crisis to the great American story, to the nation's grateful memory of the generation of 76, of the revolutionary patriots who created the nation, and all those others who had sacrificed so much to make the nation's grand experiment in democracy into a success. As we know, Lincoln's great speech did not succeed in preventing a war in his time. But that does not mean that his prescription was the wrong one for other times, including our own. We too live in a fractious period of disunity, full of disturbing portents, one in which there is loose and somewhat irresponsible talk of civil war. But we also have an even longer and more illustrious national history to appeal to now, even in our current time of national discontent and strife. Put it this way, we have an even more impressive orchestra of mystic chords to hear and heed. Lincoln could point back to Lexington and Concord, to the Declaration, and to the miracle at Philadelphia that produced the Constitution. We have so much more. We have Gettysburg, Promontory, Summit, Ellis Island, Iwo Jima, West Berlin, Selma, dozens of other places that serve as markers for the progress of the American spirit. But we cannot draw effectively on a history we've forgotten, or worse, have never known at all. Such comprehensive ignorance, such abject erasure of the past is no longer a hypothetical danger, but a clear and present one. In that sense, I hope that Land of Hope can be a small but helpful contribution to the much larger project of national restoration. And I thank you.
There's alligators in there just to get you. Thank you very much, Bill. Wonderful overview of the book, and it stressed fantastically what also jumps out from the book itself, which is a sense that our history can be a source of unity. And I wanted to start out by asking you about that in particular. There's a way in which our politics now is using history as a source of division, whether that's to describe the American story as rooted in sin and so an expression of oppression, or really whether it's to draw out of the American story proof that the other side is betraying the American tradition. Has our history been used as a source of unity traditionally? Is this kind of division in fact something new, or is this always a danger that's inherent in the actual use of history itself?
I think it's always a danger. I think it's in it, and I think we have, history's been contested. Certainly, just to go back to the Civil War period, since I just spent so much time on it, but there were debates, and they're interesting debates. They're not without intellectual merit about the meaning of the Constitution. What sort of, was it a compact? Did it sort of reestablish the states on a different basis? So that they sacrificed their sovereignty, as Southerners increasingly insisted that it had not. These are debates. They're fueled by interest, as historical debates always are. Nobody ever engages in a historical debate in a completely disinterested way, but they're legitimate. They're legitimate issues. I often feel that in teaching about the development of American institutions, that you really have to see a kind of dialectic between opponents, the most salient example of which being the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debate, because there's so much in the Anti-Federalist critique of the Constitution that has not only was sensible and valid at the time, but has actually been borne out. Of course, we have the Bill of Rights, among other things, thanks to those roguish Anti-Federalists. So even though we tend always to look to the Federalist papers when we're in a period of constitutional upheaval, as we have been lately, the Anti-Federalists are, maintaining that debate, that dialectic, that tension as part of our understanding of the past, I think is very important. By the way, I do want to remark on that it is interesting how in time, and I guess this can't I try to be even-handed from a partisan standpoint, but this won't be a very even-handed statement, that how people who are quite willing to dispense with the Constitution or tinker with it radically when we have times of national crisis, when there's really critical issues that go to the foundations of our institutions in play, why is it they always come back to the Constitution, the Federalist Papers? You know, the four legal scholars who testified not long ago for the House, they were talking about the Federalists every other breath. So there is a way in which those documents and the document for which they serve as a commentary are the anchor that we always come back to, even though it's a contested anchor. You know, where the Constitution is not a simple document that yields its truths to any casual reader. Everything in it has been fought over, and will continue to be.
You talked about the extraordinary Dos Passos quote that you start with. What jumped out at me in that quote is that history is the grandfather of our thoughts.
I love that too.
A really wonderful way to think about how to get over the tension between us and our fathers and actually learn from the past.
Yes, I'm glad you caught that, because I mean every time I read that, I'm tempted to say, notice that he says grandfathers and not fathers, because you think about the difference in the relationship of grandparents and grandchildren. There's something very special about that. There's an inheritance that leaps over the sort of Freudian, edible kind of, fathers and children, mothers and children, that over that dialectic to a less frictional, more, I won't say it's disinterested, but it's a more generous, less conflictual transposition or transfer of knowledge and sentiment.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it does take us out of this sort of sense that we have to do things exactly the way our fathers did. It says we're operating within a paradigm that may be broader than the specific things that our fathers did, but may embody values and aspirations that are more broadly and deeply part of the story.
Okay. I'm eager to open things up to people in the room, but I since you mentioned that you chose the cover art, the image on the cover is a very Hamiltonian idea of America. Is that the hope inherent in America? Is America a land of that kind of material, commercial, urban promise? This could have been a wheat field.
Well,
said something
can
else,
I tell you
right?
the story about this? When Encounter, they had a magnificent designer. I can't think of his name now, but he was really a wonderful guy, a freelance person they hired, and he did a version of this using a Grant Wood painting that was a beautiful sort of landscape, and actually just from a design standpoint, it was fabulous. And I said, yeah, I like this, but we can't do this. We can't do this because I don't want. It's bad enough that it's going to be called Land of Hope, but if I put this sort of pastoral scene on there, the conclusion people are going to draw is, well, this is all about the sort of American past that never was, this kind of thing, and dealing with America as an agrarian society. Which, so I said, I want to find something that has is urban in character, has an urban feel, but has some of that sort of upward feeling that you get when you walk into a cathedral. So the staff at Encounter was very helpful, and we looked and looked and looked for weeks, and finally I stumbled on this. And I'd never seen it before. It did seem to me to have that upward thrust, that sense of ambition. So there is a Hamilton. I wasn't thinking in these terms of America as commercial republic, but I was thinking of it as a land of aspiration and of opportunity and of sort of bustling energy, rather than that very sylvan and peaceful agrarian landscape.
Well, there's lots more to get into, but I want to bring people in the room in. So raise your hands. We'll get you with a microphone. I only ask that you tell us who you are and try to ask a question. If there are questions to start with here, there's one in the back right there. We can reach you.
Bill, my name is Harry Ballin. Thank you very much, Bill, for this magnificent book. And thank you to the American Enterprise Institute for this occasion for us to hear your remarks. You spoke about land of hope, you spoke about hope, you spoke about story. You didn't say anything about the invitation, and I want to ask you about that. In other high school texts about the American story, less attention, it seems to me, is paid to the 17th century English context, and I would say the religious divisions are not treated with the seriousness with which you treat them. And I wonder whether you intended an invitation to the background in Europe of religious strife, and whether the invitation is not merely an invitation to the American story, but the invitation to the story that precedes that story and to the grandfathers of the grandfathers. Was that intentional?
Yeah, well, I want to say yes because I want to take credit for it. No, here's what I had two things in mind with the invitation. One was, I wanted to make it clear, I'm not pretending to produce the definitive one-volume American history. This is not the Henry Steele Commager, Samuel A. Morrison follow-on. You know, it's longer than I wanted it to be, to tell you the truth. I just couldn't make it any shorter. But I wanted it to be short. I wanted it to be compact. I wanted it to be accessible to young people. And I did not want to strive for a definitive text. So that's part of the invitation. Is that, you know, an invitation to the party is not the party. You know, and that leads to the other thing, is that I do feel that for a lot of people, young and old, this is a story that either they don't know, they're afraid to go into too much, because they have this sort of sense that, you know, there be dragons there, you know, there's nothing much to be proud of about it. This is something I think young people particularly have a sense that the American past is a sort of endless procession of Confederate flags, you know, so to speak. That there's nothing that one can avoid having to apologize for in that, which I think is absurd, but it is what it is. It is where we are.
Is that your students' expectation now when you teach this? You've been teaching American history for a while. Is this distinctly a time when people expect to be taught about race first and foremost, and to think of American history as a procession of Confederate
imperialism and, you know, all of those sorts of things? Yes, I have a way of formulating it that I think puts it, I think is absolutely correct. That and it has to do with I call it the two defaults. When I started teaching in the 1980s, late 1980s, and I taught the American History Survey. You know, I give essay questions. I'm one of those types, and because I don't think the other kinds of questions really test anything. You know, part of what you're dealing with in history is sequence and narrative and the connections between ideas and events. So you know, I do occasionally do the other way, but I always have essays. And you know, you'd get just a simple question. You know, why did Andrew Jackson feel so strongly about the Bank of the United States? And so you get somebody who does absolutely no clue. I don't remember Andrew Jackson, Johnson, Smith, whatever. I don't remember any of that. So you get this answer. This is default number one in 1980s. Andrew Jackson was a great American, and he cared about America, and he thought the Bank of the United States was not good for America because America was the greatest nation in human history, and it didn't need to have a bank. So, and then on and on with the sort of Stars and Stripes Forever conclusion. And
it's not a bad answer in its own way.
Well, you know, it would pull my heartstrings a little bit, and I'd give it a D-. But that's the default was, and it's not because that was necessarily what they believed. It's what they thought I wanted to hear, and that would help them kind of get out of this jam with the minimum amount of damage to their grade. Well, now default number two is sort of Obama's apology tour. It's sort of, well, Andrew Jackson was a bitter, malicious, violent man who actually this shows more knowledge than default one did. But and he was a racist and he was an imperialist and so on and so forth. So therefore, he was opposed to the Bank of the United States because America is an imperialist, fascist, racist. What this has to do with the Bank of the United States is anybody's guess. But so there is that, again, that sense that this is what I want to hear. This is what they believe coming out of high school or whatever. This is what they think the teacher wants you to say. So I think we've switched from default number one to default number two. Neither one is worth a hill of beans, if I may put it in a somewhat anodyne form. Because they both proceed from ignorance, they're both posturing, they're both reflecting a complete absence of historical knowledge or interest in the historical past. But it is interesting that the fallback, the default, is to say, America's been arrogant. I think that was one of Obama's favorite lines. We've been arrogant. Yeah. Whereas the default number one would be, as I say, stars and stripes forever. So that tells you something. It's a crude measure of the worst students, but it tells you something about the general sort of set of expectations that we're up against. And I did find this when just meeting people, someone my daughter was dating, I met him over dinner, and the first thing he said, well, how do you deal with Indian removal? And I said, well, that's the first question, is how do I deal with Indian? And that's an important subject, again, related to Jackson, but it's not the only subject. Good grief. We've marginalized the center of American history in our interest in better understanding the margins, which are real. I don't want to put down people in my profession who have, many of whom have done very good work, and particularly in the field of slavery, study of slavery. You may have noticed, some of you are aware of this, that several leading historians, including leading historians of slavery, have come out against the 1619 Project. And in general, the profession has been very quiet about it. Because I think people know that this is bad history. It really, even in a very left-wing historical profession, people are not willing to go that far.
Take another question back here.
It may be that you don't cover this period, but you said there were dozens of other places that serve as markers for the progress of the American spirit. And I wondered whether what you got from that in the period since 1970.
Oh, well, yeah, I'd have to think about that for a minute, because that's not it's not a period that doesn't jump out at me as being full of heroes. But what I do in the 70s, which you might find kind of interesting, and I'm trying to get everybody to buy the book, of course, so is I talk about. Okay. Since that, well, let me talk about the 70s for a second, because I talk about the Watergate, the defeat in Vietnam, or the sense of defeat in Vietnam, and the general sense of the ebbing of American power that I think reaches a kind of culmination in the Carter administration. But I also talk about the extraordinary role of the bicentennial celebration and the tall ships that some of us who are old enough to remember, the tall ships in New York Harbor and other harbors on the East Coast. What a tremendous, this was broadcast on television, watched by millions of people. And it was the most interesting effect, because bicentennial was very nearly botched. They spent 10 years working on it, very nearly it didn't produce anything. And things like this came along. Warren Berger helped to rescue John Warner and others, but the tall ships, I think, sticks in many people's minds as the epitomizing that. What did that have to do with the national story, I can't exactly say, except that it was restorative of a kind of sense of national promise, possibility, and it did so by drawing on the past, by drawing on these magnificent ships in the past. Look, I'm very favorable to Ronald Reagan, to answer your question. I'm not completely uncritical, but I'm favorable to him. And what after the end of the Cold War, the sort of intensive narrative stops, and what I end up doing with the last chapter is arguing that in fact, from the standpoint of writing a textbook, we are still dealing with questions that have come with the end of the Cold War, and we haven't completely resolved them. So I really feel that the closer you get to the present, the harder it is to avoid partisanship. So, but no, I think I do present Reagan in very, 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 very positive way, except for the deficits. I'm a bit of a deficit hawk in this book.
That last chapter on America since the Cold War is interesting. The Cold War ended 30 years ago. A book of American history written in 1960 probably wouldn't have stopped in 1930. There's
that's
something
right.
extraordinary about, there's a sense in that chapter that we haven't found our way.
Yes, and that I think, and I end talking about all the polling data about the distrust of our institutions and across the board, and our $22 trillion debt and so on. I mean, I do end in a less than happy way, but with the sense that really these challenges are not beyond us, because look at the things we've surmounted in the past. So, yeah, I'm glad you added that about the 70s. Were I don't have a lot of good things to say about the 70s, but the 80s I do. Yes.
Let's take another question right there.
Thank you, Yuval. I'm Roger Pilon with the Cato Institute. Professor McClay, you opened your remarks by alluding to the parlous state of the teaching of American history today in the colleges and universities. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, the source of it, what's to be done about it, apart from the adoption of your book, which would be a good...
People have to read it.
Yes. And, well, again, with the sources of it and how it is that that may change.
Yeah, I think just... I will answer your question as you asked it, but I think at that point I was talking more about high schools and the fact that young people are not getting a coherent sense of their past. But look, I think it's equally true with the colleges and universities. One of the things that nobody in a history department wants to do is teach the survey course. In American history, European history, whatever, nobody wants to do that. And of course, part of the reason is that people have this sense, well, any time spent away from my specialty and my research is wasted. But it's actually the hardest course to teach well, because it involves constantly trying to integrate fresh insights that are coming all the time as a result of research, but yet keeping perspective. I think one of the things we've lost absolutely about our history is a sense of perspective. I was thinking of Yuval's first question that actually one of the problems is that not only that young people don't know American history, but they don't know the history of the world. So that when I tell students that slavery is a feature of virtually all human societies through human history until fairly recently, they think I'm just crazy, that I'm making this up, that I'm a lunatic. They have no idea what the history of the world looks like. And in a way to study American history without studying the larger context in which it appears is to fail to see what a light in a great deal of darkness that history is. But back to your question, I think the historical profession places a high premium on specialization, and specialization in ever more recondite fields that don't feed into a strong sense of the public meaning of history. And there are a lot of very good historians who point this out. They don't seem to realize that the way that they do things is a big part of the problem, that you need to come to the subject with some kind of synthesizing sense of the whole, some sense of the story within which these elements of research take on their meaning. So I think there's an ideological element too. One of the things that when I was working on this, I looked at about 25 or so other textbooks. And what I expected to find was, Howard Zinn is sort of the great example of a very ideologically driven white hats, black hats kind of caricature, really a cartoon version of American history. But you don't actually find that in the other textbooks. The real problem is that they are so badly written, so convoluted. So, I compared them to a hostage note in that all these things are inserted to appease various groups that are going to influence the Texas Textbook Committee. That's the holy grail of textbook publishing, and to get Texas. And other states that have centralized textbook selections. So you have these utterly incoherent accounts. I read these and I thought, how on earth can we expect young people to read this? This is horrible. I can't read it. I actually think in the end, ideology is less of a problem. It does become a problem after, I would say after 1964, including 1964. From that point on, even the very best, and the best are not all that good, but even the very best mainstream textbooks become so clearly and patently and transparently ideological that I wouldn't want to use them. But for a long time, I published a little book 20 years ago almost called The Student's Guide to U.S. History. And it was published by ISI Books. Got a lot of circulation, but people wrote to me and said, I noticed you have a bibliography and all of this, but you don't have a textbook. I said, that's because there's not a textbook I can recommend. I would email people and say, with Paul Johnson's book, when that came out, was the least bad. But, and after a while, I started feeling guilty about the fact that, why don't you? People would occasionally say, why don't you write a textbook? And I thought, forget it. But eventually I started, guilt can be a good thing. Guilt can induce us to do the things we ought to do. And so I think that was part of the reason I finally broke down and did this, because I thought, it's better to light a candle, as they say, than curse the darkness, although it may be more painful sometimes.
We're almost at the end of our time here. Are we still a land of hope? Are you hopeful about America and about the prospect of teaching Americans about their history?
Yes, I am. Yeah, it's. I think the problems that we face now are sort of first world problems. they're the problems of all humanity. I mean, how are we going to figure out the appropriate limits of our imposition of our will on nature, which is a bioethical, environmental concern. These are things that I think are going to preoccupy us in the years to come. What does it mean to be human in a world in which we have the capacity to transform so much about what we are, what's the biological complement that's given to us? Everybody's going to have to struggle with this, and I think we're better equipped than most to do it, thanks to Leon Cass, of course. But yeah, I mean, that's all I'll say about that.
Well, thank you very much. You can find the book right outside, and please help me to thank Bill McClay for a wonderful evening.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.